Hello, and welcome again to History 321. I am Dr. Ron Traylor, and this is video number 7. Pardon me, I've had a frog in my throat all morning, and I apologize for all of the animal noises that I am making. All right, we had finished in video 6 with the victory of Jackson and the Americans over the British at the Battle of New Orleans, or for those of us who are Louisianians, we know that it was actually the Battle of Chalmette. All right, so here we are in video 7, and we are going to start talking about antebellum politics in Louisiana. Now, that word antebellum is a Latin word, a two-part Latin word. The first part, ante, A-N-T-E, means before, okay? Antebellum. And the word bellum, B-E-L-L-U-M, is also a Latin word, and it means the war. So when you put the two together, you're talking about before the war. And of course, what war are we talking about? And of course, the answer is the American Civil War. So we're talking about politics in Louisiana in the years before the Civil War, in the antebellum period. Now, in the early years of statehood for Louisiana, there were only three main political factions. One were the Creoles. And as we have mentioned, but let me repeat myself, the Creoles are generally regarded to be both the French and the Spanish who were here prior to statehood. We're talking about the people who were here in the uh, before 1812. Certainly, if we want to be more specific, we're talking about the people who were here when Louisiana became a territory in 1803. So the Creoles were already here when when Louisiana became a part of the United States of America. Mostly of French ancestry. There were always more French than Spanish. Nevertheless, we cannot ignore the Spanish because they made an indelible footprint on what becomes the state of Louisiana. And most of those Creoles lived in the southern part of the state. They were planters, and they were growing things like mostly sugar cane. They were also growing things like tobacco and indigo, but mostly sugar cane. The second group, oddly enough, they're also French, but they were referred to as the foreign French. They were the French people who were living in Louisiana who could not track their ancestry back in Louisiana itself. They had been born in France and had moved here. So they were first generation Louisianians who were also pure French. And most of them lived in the city of New Orleans. And they were not actually they were not too politically active. And then there were, now, in those two groups, there are subgroups, are there not? For example, among the foreign French, I suppose we could count the Islanos, who came from the Canary Islands that were owned by Spain. Also during this time are the Acadians, who come into Louisiana as a result of being expelled, the Great Expulsion from Nova Scotia by the British when England wins the French and Indian War. And then the third group, the Americans. um, Boy, it's hard to describe who these Americans were because they moved into Louisiana from every possible place in the United States. Also, oddly enough, the Americans included British people, especially British who had migrated into Spanish Florida at an earlier date for various reasons. One of the main reasons being that when the United States wins the American Revolution, some of these British loyalists don't want to live in the United States, and so they moved to Spanish West Florida, where oddly enough and ironically enough, given enough time, the United States catches up with them, and the United States eventually is going to own Florida. We know that. We also know that West Florida is going to rebel against Spanish rule and is going to be absorbed into the colony of Louisiana, the territory of Louisiana. It's in order to figure out where the Americans are coming from, you really have to have a scorecard and you have to have a pretty decent working knowledge of the history of this area already. Now, where did most of the Americans in Louisiana live at that time, at the moment of statehood? Well, mostly in the Florida parishes, right where we are today, and in Louisiana north of the Red River. Now, we have said, and I cannot stress this too strongly, the Constitution of 1812, our first state constitution, was not a democratic document. We have talked about how only property owners who owned X amount of property, taxable property, could run for public office and could even vote. That's not too democratic, is it? It's certainly not. Uh, it wouldn't meet the standard that we have today for democracy. Those voting restrictions of the Constitution contained in the Constitution of 1812 guaranteed the Creoles would be a strong force in Louisiana politics because Creoles initially controlled much of the property and other wealth of this new state of Louisiana. Remember, the rights of citizenship uh, were based on your wealth, the amount of taxable property that you owned. And the question is, who owned most of the property? And the answer is the Creoles. Therefore, the Creoles automatically were going to have a lot of political power. Now, that begins to change as more and more and more Americans move in and they themselves acquire property and they themselves acquire wealth. But at the very beginning, in 1812, when Louisiana becomes a state, it's the Creoles uh, that have so much of the political power. Also, because of population density or the lack of population density, most of the people who lived in Louisiana lived in the southern part of the state, specifically the southeastern part of the state, because that's where the larger towns are located. I mean, Baton Rouge, right? Southeast Louisiana, New Orleans, southeastern Louisiana. That is where most of the Creoles lived. That's even where many of the foreign French lived. Remember, we said that many of them lived in New Orleans. And so Creoles almost, and so the more people your area had, the more representation you had, that district had, that area had um, in Baton Rouge, uh, in the state capitol, in the state senate, and the state house of representatives. So Um, the Louisiana legislature was sort of top heavy with representatives and senators from southeastern Louisiana, and the opposite is true. It had very few representatives and state senators from outside southeastern Louisiana. Now, that is going to cause that's going to cause problems in the future, isn't it? As more and more people move into the state, many of those people who move into the state move into the northern part of the state, the area of the state that traditionally has not had a lot of people. And they become farmers, they become plantation owners. A number of them became, they accumulate enough wealth to where they would normally qualify to vote and to hold office. But they can't hold office, they can't become members of the state legislature because the Constitution of 1812 lays out how many representatives and how many senators will come from each part of the state. Now, that is significant. Remember what I said? I said that one of the main weaknesses of the Constitution of 1812 was how difficult it was to amend it, how difficult it was to change it. What we've said that uh, it took unanimity. There's that fancy word. It took unanimity. It took a unanimous vote in order to call for a constitutional convention in order to change, to amend the Constitution of 1812. And so, for until the Constitution of 1812 was uh, amended and redistricting was done around the state uh, to make it more fair for the new people who have moved into the places outside of southeastern Louisiana, this inequity is going to continue to exist. Other tensions existed in the state of Louisiana. New Orleans generally supported the Creoles politically. Remember, the Creoles had most of that early power. And New Orleans, many of the people who lived in New Orleans were, in fact, Creoles. And so it makes sense that generally New Orleans would support Creole political issues and Creole political positions. But sometimes the country parish Creoles, okay, would join with the Americans on certain issues that went against the wants and the wishes of the city Creoles and the city of New Orleans. And so conflict between New Orleans and the New Orleans Creoles arose against the uh, the country, the rural Creoles, and sometimes the Americans. And by the way, that conflict in many ways still exists in the state of Louisiana. I remember years ago, one of my political science teachers said that that Louisiana is fundamentally divided into three parts. There is northern Louisiana, there is southern Louisiana, and there's New Orleans. And what he said, and I have never forgotten this, he said that in order to make a successful run for a statewide office in Louisiana, governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, those are people from all over the state uh, uh, vote in those statewide elections. He said, in order to win a statewide election, you got to have either North Louisiana and New Orleans, or you got to have South Louisiana and New Orleans. But what's the common denominator there? You always must win New Orleans. So New Orleans has always been an important player in Louisiana politics. Now, not only were there political frictions, but there were other frictions as well as political friction. There was the friction between Roman Catholic and Protestant. Now, at the beginning, back in Louisiana was a French colony, and later when it was a Spanish colony, and then even later when it reverted to being a French colony, religion was really not a problem because both the French and the Spanish required people who moved into Louisiana to convert to Roman Catholicism if they were not already Roman Catholics. But now, Louisiana is part of the United States of America, and the Bill of Rights guarantees the free exercise of religion. So it doesn't matter if you're a Roman Catholic or whether you're a Protestant with regard to your ability to vote or your ability to hold office. But it's still important. It's still important. I remember being raised out in the little rural community of Pumpkin Center, just a few miles west of Hammond. And it was uh, overwhelmingly not only Protestant, it was overwhelmingly Southern Baptist. Uh, Everyone was aware of those few families that were Roman Catholic. They stuck out like a sore thumb. Furthermore, oddly enough, it got to the point where we were even very aware of the families that were not Southern. They were Protestant, but they weren't Southern Baptist. We knew who the Methodists were, right? And that's always been true in Louisiana. There is this friction between Roman Catholics and Protestants. There was also friction between cotton growers and sugar growers. Um, Sugar was a crop that was best grown in South Louisiana, which is not to say you can't grow it in North Louisiana, but the conditions are just about perfect here in South Louisiana to grow sugar, especially in what we still refer to as the sugar parishes, which include parishes like, let me see now, St. James, St. John the Baptist, St. Charles, um, and all up and down Bayou Teche and all up and down Bayou Lafourche. Those are the so-called sugar parishes of Louisiana. And it created fantastic wealth for those who grew sugar. But there was another crop, and we've talked about this already. But let's make believe that I've not even mentioned cotton. Okay, so can we just start from sort of square one and talk about cotton? Cotton, um, the cotton gin was perfected around 1795, 96 or so. Prior to that event, cotton was not an important crop in the United States. And the reason it was not important is because of how difficult it was to separate the cotton seed from the cotton fiber, as it had to be done by hand. Now, I've read in several places that a really good slave who was really, really good at separating that cotton seed from that cotton fiber could separate the seed from the fiber of about 1 pound of cotton per day. That's not much. And it involved, and when I say a day, I'm not talking about an 8-hour day like we have now. I'm talking probably about a 10 or a 12-hour day. So, cotton uh, becomes a very expensive fabric. Because remember the first rule of Economics 101: when a thing is scarce, and cotton fabric was scarce because of how difficult it was to separate the seed from the fiber. When a thing becomes scarce, the price of the thing goes up. So cotton was expensive. There was not a lot of demand for cotton because it was so expensive. And so it was a minor crop in the United States prior to the perfection of the cotton gin. But boy, as my children used to say when they were attending Texas A&M, boy howdy, when the cotton gin was perfected, the cultivation of cotton just exploded all over the country, and it exploded in the state of Louisiana, especially northern Louisiana. So generally, cotton became very common north of the Red River, outside of the Florida parishes. Okay. Sugar and cotton farmers had different goals. Laws that protected sugar, for example, might not necessarily protect cotton. Uh, uh, Tariffs that might protect cotton might not necessarily protect sugar. And so sugar and cotton growers had different agendas, and as a result, there was always this conflict between the two of them. There was also the fundamental friction that was caused by the cities versus the small towns and the rural areas. What was good for the city was not necessarily good out in the countryside, and vice versa. And then there was a conflict between uh, big farmers and small farmers. Um, Big farmers, plantation owners, whether it was sugar or cotton, um, needed special treatment by the government, special treatment by Louisiana government, special treatment by the United States government, to profitably export their goods to other countries. Small farmers, quite often, never exported a thing. They literally had 40 acres, and they raised on that 40 acres everything that they needed to survive. They raised all of their food, and if there was something that they needed that they couldn't raise, let's say they needed gunpowder to go hunting to get fresh meat, right? Uh, how do you afford the gunpowder? Well, they would just raise a little bit more food, and they would sell that. They wouldn't eat it; they would sell it, and they would then take that money and use it to buy the things that they couldn't raise for themselves. And there are a number of things that they couldn't do for themselves, like, I mean, shoes. How many of us are expert cobblers, right? You got to buy shoes. Now, you can weave your own cloth, though, can't you? But what if you want a really nice suit, or the ladies want a really nice dress to wear to church on Sunday? You don't want to wear that rough, what was referred to as homespun fabric. You want to go down to the local general store and buy some fabric and sew yourself a nice set of clothes. Now, let's talk about antebellum national politics in Louisiana for just a moment. Creoles, initially, when we became a state, 1812, Creoles were initially much more concerned about controlling the state of Louisiana. They were more concerned about political control at the state level than they were concerned about national politics, or participating in national politics. And this is understandable. Remember, the French and the Spanish had been colonists. They had been subjects of the French and the Spanish empires. And what is the only real obligation of a subject? Well, it's really very simple. It is to obey whatever the king or the queen tells you to do. And so we had been, the people of Louisiana, most of us, by 1812 had been, we had been subjects of either the French or the Spanish since the early 1700s. It was more than 100 years. And so it had become um, a very acceptable thing that you simply didn't worry about what was happening back in Spain. You just waited for the king to give orders and you obeyed them. The thing that the French and the Spanish Creoles were most concerned about was what was happening here in Louisiana. And that sort of carries over after Louisiana makes that transition from being uh, a colony of one of those two nations to being first of all, a territory of the United States, and then rather soon thereafter, a state. So, Creoles were initially more concerned about political control at the state level than they were at what was happening at the national level. And as a result, those early residents of Louisiana, mostly consisting of French and Spanish Creoles, left national politics to the Americans. But by the 1830s, that was beginning to change. And we will talk about that at the appropriate time. But I will simply begin to tell you, I will tell you that around the 1830s, citizens of Louisiana began to make that transition from being more concerned about what was happening in Louisiana and less concerned about what was happening in Washington to being sort of equally concerned. They remained concerned about what happens in Louisiana, but they become much more aware and much more concerned with what is happening in Washington. And they even begin to affiliate themselves with the two major parties, which at this time were the Democrats and the Republicans, and later would become the Democrats and the Whigs. By the way, that's Whigs, Whigs. Now, while we're talking about those parties, let me give you just a real thumbnail sketch of what those two major parties believed in. What were the philosophies? What were the policies of the Democrats and the Whigs? Let's start with the Whigs first. The Whigs generally favored the Bank of the United States. Now, we'll talk about that in more detail, but please just write that down for right now. The Whigs favored the Bank of the United States. They also favored internal improvements that were financed by the national government. We'll talk about that as well. Just write that down, okay? Internal improvements financed by the federal government. The Whigs also favored protective tariffs. Now, we've mentioned tariffs just a few moments ago when we talked about the sugar growers, especially. And the Whigs also favored, now, this sounds funny looking back on it from almost 200 years in the future, but the Whigs pretty much also favored anything that would hurt Andrew Jackson and his supporters. Now, how about the Democrats? What did they support? What did they believe in? What were their policies? Well, if you know what the Whig policy is, then you already know what the Democratic policy was because it was pretty much the exact opposite of whatever the Whigs believed. For example, the Democrats opposed the Bank of the United States. They did not want the United States government to pay for internal improvements. The Democrats said that if you want to create some of these internal improvements, it should be paid for by the state where the improvement is going to be, where it's going to take place. The Democrats generally opposed tariffs, and they opposed a really strong central government. and I left that one out. The Whigs, add this to the Whig column, please. The Whigs really preferred a strong central government, while the Democrats would prefer not a weak central government, because that had never worked. Remember, that's what we had during the Articles of Confederation government, and that was a disaster. But they supported a weaker central government. Generally, the Democrats were strong in Louisiana overall, with periods of strength coming and going for the Whigs. Now, I'm going to read you a list of the Louisiana governors between 1803, when we became a territory, and 1860, which is the last full year that we were a state prior to seceding from the Union. Now, I do not expect you to memorize these. I don't even expect you to write these down. But I'm going to try to make a point here. Remember, we have said that in the early part of statehood, that the Creoles pretty much controlled Louisiana politically. But we've also said that as more and more of these so-called Americans move into the state, that Creole influence begins to abate, and the American influence begins to rise. Now, these are in order, the governors, the last name governors of the state of Louisiana. And I want you to notice how many French sounding names there are toward the beginning, and how the French names begin to drop off, and names that we would associate with America begin to dominate. Here we go. Of course, Claiborne was the only territorial governor that the state ever had, and he becomes the first state governor of Louisiana. He's followed by Jacques Villeray, then Thomas Robertson, a very English sounding name, followed by Henri Thibodeau. Good gracious, boy, I bet that boy was French, huh? Followed by an American sounding name, Henry Johnson. Then Pierre de Bigny, Armand Beauvoir, Jacques Dupree, Andre Roman, Alexander Mouton. Okay, and that's pretty much where the Creole governors end, because after that it's Isaac Johnson, Joseph Walker, Paul Hebert. Oh, got an Hebert there in the middle. Robert Wycliffe and Thomas More. So you can see how just by looking at the names of the governors, you can reach certain conclusions. And the conclusion, if you reach this conclusion, you'd be right that the Creoles were in power in Louisiana long after Louisiana becomes a state. Now, let's put it in academic terms. The power of the French Louisianians declined as the antebellum period continued. Fewer French named governors appeared. The Creoles and the foreign French in Louisiana became just factions within new political coalitions. And of course, those new political coalitions are the Democrats and the Whigs. Now, prior to the Civil War, much of Louisiana was an undeveloped wilderness. I mean, there was New Orleans and Baton Rouge, Monroe, Natchitoches, Opelousas, Shreveport, and other little villages, but those are basically the Brashear City. I almost forgot Brashear City. We don't even, you say, what the heck is Brashear City? I never heard of that. Well, there's a reason. That was the original name of the present day Louisiana town of Morgan City. Okay, Brashear, Brashear. or I'm not sure. It was probably named after Mr. Brashear. All right. Okay. But except for those communities, Louisiana was an undeveloped wilderness. And the popular political issues became the issues that encouraged growth, that encouraged prosperity. And what were some of those issues? The issues that encouraged prosperity and growth? How about education? With the exception of the Ursulines Academy in New Orleans, there are very few schools in the entire state of Louisiana at that time. Here's the term that I mentioned earlier without explaining it. So let me explain it to you now. Internal improvements. What the heck is an internal improvement? Well, we don't call these things internal improvements anymore. We call them infrastructure. What is an internal improvement? They are roads, bridges, ferries, canals. Quite often, an internal improvement is something that makes it easier to travel from point A to point B. Before statehood, and after, for that matter, if you wanted to go somewhere in Louisiana, you either had to walk or you had to ride a horse, or more commonly, you had to travel by water. You had to cross a lake on a barge or a flatboat, or you had to sail up a river, or you had to float down a river, depending strictly on the speed of the current. It's just the most amazing thing that I can jump on Interstate 12 right here in Hammond, and I can drive to our old home in Dayton, Texas, which is almost 300 miles away, and I can do that in less than 5 hours. And that's driving at a sane speed because the roads are good and you can safely travel at high speed. One of the things that we talked about when we talked about the Battle of New Orleans was how amazing it was that Andrew Jackson was able to get his troops from Alabama to Chalmette in such a relatively short period of time, considering the terrible terrain that they had to navigate through. Something else that had to be dealt with was the Indians. We always lose track of the fact that there were still Indians in Louisiana when Louisiana becomes a territory in 1803 and becomes a state in 1812. And the question still was then, and still is, well, not so much today. That's pretty much been settled. But the question then was, what are we going to do with all these Indians? Louisiana still was dealing with pirates. We have made heroes out of Jean Lafitte and Dominique You and all those guys who fought for Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans. But the reality is that they were privateers only for short periods of their career. The other time, the rest of it, they were pirates and they were smugglers. Remember, please, that the ban on the Atlantic slave trade had ended officially in 1808. Jean Lafitte continued to smuggle uh, Africans into not just Louisiana, but other states of the Union and other countries like Texas, right? Remember, Texas was not a part of the United States back then. It belonged first to Spain, and then it belongs to Mexico. Louisianians had to deal with health problems also. Yellow fever, periodically, a yellow fever epidemic would sweep through New Orleans, for example, and kill 25% of the people there. Cholera, cholera and dysentery. Both of those diseases are basically caused by unsanitary living conditions. Now remember, this morning when I showered, I turned on the water and it was right there. And when I got into that shower, I could trust that water was clean and pure, that I was not going to get sick by swallowing some of that water. Um, we have sanitary sewer systems that are separated. That sewage does not uh, spread out anywhere. It's in a pipe and it goes to the sewage treatment plant where it is converted into harmless solid and liquid waste. None of that existed in Louisiana in the early 1800s. As a matter of fact, every house, pretty much every house had its own well. Now, when I think about a well today, I think about an electric well, right? You've got a pump and you're sucking water out of the ground and you're watering your plants or you're watering your crops. No, no, no. That's not what I'm talking about when I talk about a well in the early 1800s. I'm talking about a hand dug well. It's like you see in the cowboy movies, right? Uh, there's a winch, right? And around that winch is a rope, and at the end of that rope is a bucket, and you let that bucket down until it hits the water that's in the bottom of that hole, and then you draw it up and you drink it. Now, generally, that water is nice and clean, but not always. And the reason it's not always clean is that not only did most homes have a well of their own, but they also had an outhouse of their own. This is disgusting, but I've got to mention it. Quite often, the outhouse was located too close to the well, and all of that fecal matter in the outhouse, if you gave it enough time, it was going to sort of percolate down, down, down into the water table. And so when you drew water out of the well that was really close to the outhouse, the water was contaminated with what? You can use your imagination, but you know the answer to it, right? Cholera and dysentery were diseases that resulted from that type of dirty water. Now, some of the other areas, some of the other political issues that drove Louisiana politics during the early 1800s, the early 19th century, um, was, as I mentioned before, internal uh, improvements, transportation, right? Are we going to be able to get a bridge built across this river? If we're not going to get a bridge, can we at least get a ferry? Flood control. Louisiana has always been, because of its geographical, because of its physical location, Louisiana has always been prone to flooding. It doesn't take a hurricane to flood Louisiana. Remember where Louisiana is. It's at the end of the Mississippi River. Now, it doesn't snow here. I mean, it snows so seldom that we pretty much remember when it snows because it was such a unique event, right? But the Mississippi River, which passes through Louisiana, takes all that melted snow and ice from up north, and here it comes. And in the springtime, the level of the Mississippi River, and it still rises every spring. But today we have pretty sophisticated levee system. Now that's an entirely different story. Don't get me started on the inadequacies of our levee system. But for right now, let's just say that at least in theory, we have a very sophisticated levee system that keeps all that water in the river and doesn't let the river flood. But back in these days, the early 19th century, the early 1800s. The levee system was rudimentary, and there were gaps in it all along the river. And so in the springtime, whenever the river came up because of the spring melt up north, Louisiana floods. And sometimes the Mississippi River, what's the old saying? Water seeks its own level, right? Um, the Mississippi River, at times, it's been documented that during these times, the Mississippi River would, when it came up, it would spread out because there was no levee there, and it would cover the entire Mississippi River delta. So, flood control was certainly necessary. Flood control was necessary in New Orleans, if nowhere else. New Orleans was the largest town in first the territory, first the colony, then the territory, then the state. And something needed to be done to protect the city of New Orleans from these periodic flows. Louisiana also needed trustworthy banking institutions, trustworthy financial institutions. We've said, excuse me, let me take a swallow. We said that in the colonial period, that there were no locally owned banks in Louisiana. That there were banks, but they were branch banks of banks that were in the United States. And remember, when we were a colony of France and Spain, the United States was a foreign country, wasn't it? So the banks that we had were foreign banks. We don't think about it in those terms quite often, but that's exactly true. Plus, Louisiana was still struggling. Uh, Sometimes it was easier, sometimes it was harder, but Louisiana was still struggling with converting the old French and Spanish laws into American laws that could be understood by the Americans who were flooding into the state of Louisiana. Now, something bad happens in 1837. Something bad financially happens. There is a economic depression that takes place in 1837, and we are not going to go into the details of what caused it. If you'd like to get the details of that, I invite you, as a matter of fact, to join me for History 476, which is called the Age of Compromise, and we'll talk about the events that lead to that depression in 1837. Now, but so we're not going to talk about the details, but we are going to talk about it right now in general terms. Now, today we call these financial crises depressions, don't we? The Great Depression of the 1930s. Back in these days, in the 80s, in the 1830s, they didn't call it a depression. It was called a panic. It's the same thing, okay? A panic and a depression are the same thing. I personally prefer the word panic because it is a better descriptive term that describes what happens when you lose everything that you own. You don't just get depressed, right? You panic when you don't know where your next meal is coming from. When the sheriff shows up at your door with an order for you to evacuate your home or your ranch or your farm because you haven't been able to afford to pay your taxes, you don't get depressed. You get panicked. Well, a panic takes place in 1837 in the United States. And of course, excuse me, she knows. And of course, the result is the Panic of 1837 affects uh, Louisiana as well as it affects the rest of the nation. Now, This is the beginning of the end for the Constitution of 1812. More and more people become dissatisfied with the Constitution of 1812. And one of the reasons they become dissatisfied with the Constitution of 1812 is that, remember, in order to amend it requires you just to throw it out and to create a brand new Constitution. And that decision requires unanimity. Everybody has to approve of that idea. All right. So the bottom line is that the Constitution of 1812 is unable to deal with the problems that are caused, the financial problems that are caused by the Panic of 1837. And by the time 1845, it takes a while. It takes a while. But nevertheless, pardon me for this itchy nose. I don't know what to do about it except scratch it. By the time 1845 rolls around, more and more people in Louisiana are willing to throw out the Constitution of 1812 and write a new Constitution. And that includes people, influential people, people like the governor are now coming out in favor of a new Constitution. Members of the legislature, likewise, are coming out in favor of throwing that old Constitution of 1812 out and writing a new one, as well as the voters themselves. And so, in the year 1844, and then continuing into the year 1845, a convention was held in New Orleans. And the purpose of that convention was to write a new state constitution for Louisiana. Now, it begins in 44, it concludes in 1845, and as a result, we refer to this constitution, which is the second, right, the second constitution of the state of Louisiana, we refer to this as the Constitution of 1845. Now, in the few minutes that we have left available to us today, let's talk about the content of the Constitution of 1845. Well, it outlawed monopolies. In other words, one company, or maybe just a couple of companies, controlling an entire industry. All right. The Constitution of 1845 outlawed monopolies. It also outlawed the practice of the state giving subsidies to private business to encourage businesses to come into the state. Now, how does a subsidy work? Now, I'm going to oversimplify it, but we still do this, by the way. Let's say that we really want a new automobile construction facility, right? We want Ford to come in and build a production facility here in Louisiana. But Ford says, well, we like the idea of being in Louisiana, and we think that the Louisiana workers are good and that they would do a good job building Ford automobiles. But Ford says we can't afford to move to Louisiana because the taxes are too high, or the electrical power bill is going to be too much, or the fresh water bill is going to be too much, or something like that. So what does the state of Louisiana do to encourage Ford to move here? The state of Louisiana might say something like this: we will do away with any taxes to Ford Motor Company for 5 years. Or an alternative is we will reduce the taxes to Ford Motor Company by 50% for 10 years. Now, I'm making these numbers up. You understand that. But the idea is an accurate idea. Or the state of Louisiana will say, we will not charge you at all for any electrical power. Or we will permit you to take water out of the Mississippi River and purify it, and we will pay for that. At which point, Ford Motor Company, hopefully, will say, "Oh, you'll do that for us? You'll save us that much money? That'll really look good to our stockholders. Yes, we'll take the deal. We will build the production plant." Okay. Subsidies like that had been going on in Louisiana as the result of the content of the Constitution of 1812. And those subsidies were now outlawed. Okay, let me spell that word for you. So, subsidy. Some of you might not be familiar with that. Subsidy. Subsidy. The Constitution of 1845 put a ceiling on state debt. It literally said that the state of Louisiana cannot spend more money than it brings in tax revenue. All right. In other words, you cannot spend more than you've got. When you spend all the money, you can't borrow money. You just got to stop spending until the next year rolls around. Now, according to the Constitution of 1812, judgeships had been appointed by the governor, but the Constitution of 1845 made many, if not all, of those judgeships into elective offices. The people would now choose those judges. Now, with regard to the Louisiana State Supreme Court, though, those justices had also been appointed, and they remained appointed, but they took away that life appointment. Remember, what it was if you were a Supreme Court justice, you were a Supreme Court justice for life, unless you did something that was terrible. Fire you then. So the Constitution of 1845 kept the idea of an appointive state Supreme Court justice, but it took away the life appointment. In other words, they had to be reappointed periodically. They had to be reappointed. They were appointed at first, and they had to be reappointed periodically in order to keep their seat. The Constitution of 1845 called for the establishment of public schools in Louisiana. It also gave the Supreme Court jurisdiction in criminal cases. And what we call that is it gave the Supreme Court the right of the appeal. The Supreme Court will be the final decision maker when it came to criminal cases. You've been accused of murder. You've been found guilty in murder. Now you can appeal your case to the Supreme Court of the state of Louisiana, and that Supreme Court will have the final say-so about what happens to that case. Not only did the Constitution of 1845 call for the establishment of public schools, but it also created for the first time the office of the lieutenant governor. There had never been. Now remember the Constitution of 1812, and now here it is, 1845. What's that? 33 years that the Constitution of 1812 was in effect. We had never had a lieutenant governor. We had a governor, but no lieutenant governor. Well, now you got one. Now, the Constitution of 1845 also called for the direct election of the governor. Remember the way it had been before? The people voted, but but they didn't actually elect the governor. What they did was they created a short list of names from whom the legislature then chose the governor. And the Constitution of 1845 led to the universal male suffrage. In other words, if you were an adult, free male, you could vote. In other words, the religious qualification is taken away. The property owning is taken away. If you are alive and you're breathing, and if you are an adult, free male, you could vote. With this exception, they created a 2-year residency requirement. You couldn't vote. You could only vote, let's put it this way, you could only vote after you had been living in the state of Louisiana for 2 years or more. But except for that, it's universal male suffrage. All right, that's an hour, and that's pretty good timing because I just finished that thought. We are going to wind this up, and I will. This was what was this? Was this number 6 or was this number 7? Because I can never remember. That was number 7. Okay, we will begin with number 8 soon, and until then, I'll see you.